It's time to have a genuine conversation about masculinity and if perception is truly reality for men across America. According to my friends at the Pew Research Center, they reveal that 46% of the population of men across America believe that it's important for them to be seen as masculine, with only 9% of men admitting that it's very important to them, which could very well indicate that men are reprioritizing what is important to them, or at least coming to the realization that there are different ways to define value. This could also open the door to allow men to evolve in their thinking and define success under different circumstances. It's a question that my friend Timothy Wienecke helps men navigate each and every day. He's a licensed psychotherapist, educator, and men's advocate. He has spent the better part of 2 decades learning with and helping men and people navigate the hard times which life throws at all of us. He uses his experience and expertise to help people discover the best path forward. And he says, specifically for men, he's tired of the stereotypes surrounding the perceived definition of what it means to be masculine. And he helps men to reshape their belief when it comes to this very objective. And he's also served in several capacities of leadership, including an advocate, representative, a sergeant, an airman, a mentor, and an organizer. He joined me this week to have a deep and meaningful conversation about men's masculinity, effective leadership, and how men can refocus on the important values of their life, which provides them both increased integrity, clarity, and a sense of purpose. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation.
Of course, man. I love what you do. I'm more than happy to help.
Absolutely. So, Tim, I thank you for that compliment, my friend, and I welcome you to the program. And I'm super excited to dive into men's mental health and marriages with you this morning and how you help them become better leaders. Great to see you, and happy Saturday to you, my friend.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I know, Tim, that you've spent the last 2.5 decades helping men sort of navigate their mental health and marriage journey by leveraging your own experience, both professionally and personally, my friend. So let's start our conversation by talking about the importance of helping men really become sort of intertwined with their masculinity and how that definition has changed over the years. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Well, I think the main thing around masculinity that we need to recognize is that we need to move away from this model of rigid masculinity, where there's only one way to be a man, there's only one way to be a woman, there are no other options, and any deviation from that makes you less. And we're starting to really see a good push for that, where people are acknowledging, I'm not one thing. Like, yes, I'm a man. Yes, I'm a woman. Yes, I'm non-binary. But there are these different parts of ourselves. And I think where that really can become empowering to men is that it removes the idea of the toxicity from the idea of the masculinity. And I think that's the only way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely, my friend. And, Tim, it's ironic that I'm having this conversation with you in July because, as you may know, buddy, July is National Disability Pride Month, and I'm curious to tie that into inclusivity for men in terms of their emotional intelligence, my friend. So, how do you think we can encourage men to become more emotionally inclusive, my friend? How important do you think that is?
I think it's the only way to break this isolation epidemic. I think we've developed out this story of masculine stoicism. And the way I like to frame it is, you have capital S stoicism, which is like the Roman philosophy, right? Which is wonderful and helps a lot of people. And you have the little s stoicism, which is simply the emotional flatness, the emotional disconnect that's expected of men in America to exhibit. The John Wayne effect, if you will. And it is incredibly hard to feel connected if you can't even identify the emotions you're feeling. You can't see them in others. You can't connect and resonate with people. And we're starting to move on that, but if you look at who's teaching us, right, we basically put the idea of the emotional as a feminine trait, that women are the ones carrying the ball on emotions. They're the ones managing it. And we removed men from that equation. So we've now had a few generations of men who weren't taught by other men what emotions were and how to experience them. And so we're refining those skills. And as we refine them, this is why men's groups are taking off. This is why the men's movement is moving away from a men's rights movement to a men's empowerment movement. And I think that's a beautiful thing. It's why I'm jumping on the train and really trying to make my impact with my work on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what do you think now means the new definition for men to lead with emotional courage? What do you think that means, Tim?
I think it's starts with awareness. You can't be courageous around emotion if you're not aware and able to describe what you're feeling to yourself. And so if you're in a leadership position and you don't have any empathy, you can't look at the people you're trying to lead and understand what they're experiencing, you really struggle to lead them well. And so if you don't have that emotional awareness to be courageous with, your leadership is going to be incredibly limited.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Tim, I'm curious to ask you about the number one or two issues you think men are struggling with today, and sort of your recipe or anecdote to treating that today, my friend. What are men telling you about their mental and emotional struggles that are related to the way we live in societal life today? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Well, so it really kind of depends on the generation of men. The overarching theme is a lot of isolation. The loneliest men in America are 45-year-old divorcees. Young men are becoming more and more isolated as we move away from societal connection and service to an online economy where you keep getting smaller and smaller groups together. And so that isolation is probably the biggest impact for men. The next one is as women who've found their power and found their education, we're finding that all the ways that men were protected in the various work and education systems, we're really insulating them from the way that men learn. And so what we see is now we have schools where you're supposed to sit still. And I don't know if you've ever been around a 5-year-old boy, but they don't sit still so well.
No, they don't.
And so by removing the barriers to women, we're seeing the cracks and flaws in our education system. And we have not done a good job of addressing those. So all of the things that started Title IX to get women caught up to men in the university and education systems have now flipped. And so what we're seeing is a system that does not support men and boys, and this expectation of men and boys that it is an individual responsibility to do well in these areas. Every time we hear about how men are struggling, the systematic struggles that are there are most often unacknowledged. And it is simply the sole responsibility. The American story of, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that a man is an island, is really impacting our way to help men and boys. And so the best thing that I see happen for men working on these things is to find those points of connection through that emotional vulnerability we were just talking about, by finding just a few people that see them, that support their values, and that help them find who they want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tim, can I also ask you about, the perceived perception of masculinity, my friend? A lot of times men equate masculinity with physical strength and being
Mm-hmm.
the physical supporter of a family. And how do we think we can rewrite or retrain the thinking for men to acknowledge that physical masculinity isn't the only way they can lead effectively in today's generation? What are your thoughts there?
I mean, you just said it. It needs to stop being the only way. I don't want to detract from the men that are prioritizing being a provider and living that life happily. But that is not the only way to masculinity. Anybody who spent any time with someone that's physically disabled knows the strength and courage to engage the world that takes. And that's a beautiful, strong thing. Masculinity is about more than one facet. So the way I like to frame it is how Richard Reeves frames it, right? We have masculine and feminine traits, and everyone has some of each. Very few people have only masculine or feminine traits. And if we acknowledge them as traits and as something that almost not everybody has, it leaves so much room to see the breadth and beauty of what masculinity can be.
Yeah, so building on that, what do you think it means for men to be effective leaders in all aspects of their lives, considering the importance that the Pew Research Center puts on masculinity in the eyes of men? They reported last year that 42% of men view their masculinity as their number one important trait on how they want to be perceived in the world, and another 43% said they were leaning that way. So how do you think we can make and realize that yes, their physical masculinity is important, but leaning into their emotions or their more communicative side is also an effective strategy as well? What are your thoughts there?
So I think it really boils down to a cultural norm across the world, where being a woman is often equated for when a woman gets her period, like it's a physical transition for them. And so if you look at cultures across the planet, womanhood is often assumed that this happens and now you're a woman. Men don't have that. We don't have a accepted physical point where because this is happening to your body and you are now a man. Masculinity and being a man is a status. And so as it's a status, people protect their status. It's important to us that it's an earned ideal. And right now, we're so fractured in what it takes to earn that status. There's no clear path. Short of military service, there really isn't a commonly accepted now you're a man moment in America. And until we broaden and name what it takes to be a man and what we see as men, we're going to keep having these caricatures where everybody has to be John Wayne to be perceived as a man. It doesn't leave room for the variation and the strength that we have in our masculinity.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tim, I'm also curious to ask you about how this portrays to societal expectations. Tim, I'm a person who believes that you can't have societal or artificial expectations without raising the level of your own expectations. And considering the political climate in America, and I'm certainly not asking you to give me your political stance, but what I'm asking for is, how do you think societal pressures affect the way we view our role in society, men's role in society, politics, current events, and the like. What do you think is the role of social pressures on the way that men perceive themselves? I'm curious to get your answer there.
I think that you can't talk about society and culture and not talk about the individual. As a clinician, one of the powerful things we learn is that we go crazy by culture. Your culture, while ethereal and not biological, is eminently impactful on how you experience the world. And so, what I see a lot of times is we have this pressure from women and from others to be emotionally expressive, to be available to that, but not a lot of room for men to learn how. And so it's incredibly common for men to come into my practice sent by their wives, where there's some kind of ultimatum. I'm done with this behavior. I need you to show up better. Go to therapy. And so I get these guys come in and we start teaching them like how to express your emotions, what they are, what to do with them. And they're not good at it. They haven't gotten to do it before. And so when they go home, all of a sudden they're telling their wives how their feelings and they're like, wait, put that back in the box. I don't want to see that. I was wrong. I just don't want you to do these things. And so we need to create room for men in this country to learn and to incorporate their entire selves. And I think why that's so hard from a cultural context is the men in power embody that stoicism and control that has been so key to our experience of masculinity. And at the end of the day, the people in power are the men that are the ways that men aspire to be. Most men have some kind of status drive to them. So of course we look to these men that are high performers, entirely not acknowledging that most of the men in those positions are divorced. Most of them are estranged from their children. It's an incredibly hard balance to hold. And we don't have a lot of systems and acknowledgement from society as a whole that there are costs to these things that don't always need to be paid.
Yeah, absolutely. So, building on that point, I'm curious, when men come to see you for the first time, in particular for therapy, I'm curious about the way you break down their emotional wall and have them express their emotion and sort of give them the permission structure to have a positive sort of self-perception of themselves. I'm wondering if you can walk me through that, my friend.
Well, I think the language around it is important. I don't break any walls for my patients. One of the big things that we've made mistakes on in how we frame men's emotions are a man will tell you how they feel. So when a man's broken up with a woman or anybody really that they love, they'll, rather than saying, I felt betrayed, I felt abandoned, what they say is, she ripped my heart out. There's a kinetic expression to how men describe their world. And we need to stop expecting that to change entirely. And we need to stop saying it's wrong. So the first thing I do is validate how they experience the world. As they tell me what's going on, I reflect back their experience. I reflect back the language they use and let them know that that is seen and valid. That's the first step, because the main way that we connect to emotion has largely been a more feminine approach, which is to use language and deep descriptions and empathetic language describing emotion, which is also a valid way to experience in the world. But by denying that both of these ways are valid, we can't bridge the gap. So first, you have to start with acknowledging that the way that you're experiencing your world is real, it's valid. Now let's talk about how to express that to other people so they can understand. One of the best ways to express empathy is, rather than using like a physical sensation or an emotional word, saying something like, it's like that feeling when you lost your parents in the grocery store the first time. And everyone has a memory like that. Everybody can be like, oh, that time, I know what that feels like. And they may describe that feeling in different language, but everybody can relate to it. That's what we want to do. We want to stop framing it as this idea that men are locked up in this prison because they can't describe it or don't describe it the way that others do. Instead, we need to think of it as cross-cultural communication. We need to think of it different ways to describing things we all experience. And once you do that, men open up. It's a lot safer.
Mm-hmm. And I know to one of the reasons you're passionate particularly about this work is breaking down the stereotypes or the common stereotypes surrounding men's masculinity. And you tell me about it that you're tired of having to dispel these common stereotypes, and you want people to have a different sort of viewpoint of the stereotypes that are commonly sort of associated with men's masculinity. So let's dive into the stereotypes that you're tired of, buddy, and how to reverse our thinking when it comes to those as well.
Well, so the biggest thing I think is the idea that being a man is being an island, being stoic, and being a provider. We, over the course of generations, gave up so much to prioritize that very narrow view of what a man can be. And what we also don't want to do is we don't want to throw out everything about those roles. There's nothing wrong with a family where they decide one member is going to be the primary provider, but it needs to be a choice. We need to expand what the different aspects of masculinity are and accept that different men exhibit and experience different parts of that. So for some men, they're a little bit more physically aggressive than most. Those are the men we want in the military. Those are the men we want in the police force. Those are men that we want to have outlets to successfully do that. But that doesn't detract from the men who aren't physically aggressive. It's just a difference. And once we broaden what masculinity is, we can broaden what a man can be. And really, America is the most individualistic country in the world. We prize the idea of individual identity, and yet our gender identity has to be this narrow, single column of what it is ridiculous. On the other side of it, gender matters. Gender is a key component of our identities. So the idea that gender is entirely fluid for every individual is asinine. And if you listen to advocates that are educated on the topic, they'll say so too. They'll say how I want to empower your masculinity. I want your manhood to be broader in what it can be. But that gets co-opted by popular culture and done poorly. We need to leave more room for choice. And a choice means an empowered decision. How we show up, how we choose to show up, how we exhibit these parts of ourselves becomes so much more powerful and so much more clear when we've chosen to be them instead of expected to be them.
Yeah, and so I want to go back quickly to the idea of balance that you brought up earlier, because, you know, balance and sacrifice when it comes to masculinity and coming to provide for our family most predominantly. I'm curious to get your opinion on how we can help men achieve better career and life balance, and what it means to be present from a family perspective, as well as reaching or obtaining your career goals. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
So essentially, the idea of the provider really took shape after World War II. That's when we really fractured what masculinity and femininity were, right? Women worked at home, men worked in the world, and there was a hard barrier between those two roles. Whereas previously, if you look at human history, men and women were in groups doing work. And yeah, there was a labor division, but children were around it all. And so you couldn't be so siloed in your role before. Industrialization and the idea of, a capitalist society where I am what I produce as a man. My only role is, can I produce? Can I make something that my society and my family can use? Left out the joy of being a father, the wonder of being a husband, the power of being a mentor and a friend outside of your professional capacity. And so we need that balanced life. The reason why so many men are opting out of work is because they're watching men be miserable in work. If we can't establish a balance of this job pays my bills and gives me time to do the things that refresh and empower me, or this job that gives me purpose pays me enough to live, we're not going to find those balance moments. And we as a society have to pick those. We have to advocate for those. We have to push for those. And so men can either check out of a system or engage a system. But when they engage, they need to self-advocate. And I think the younger generation of men who enter the workforce are doing a much better job of that. We're seeing people take reduced hours for less salaries. We're seeing people hold better boundaries with work to have space to be the men in their loved ones' lives. And I think that's a beautiful thing. We just need more of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tim, I'm also curious to ask you, because I know you help men strengthen their marriages as well. So what do you think it means for men to show up as marriage champions, whether they're married to a man or a woman? What do you think it means to be a champion inside the walls of your marriage, my friend?
Well, I love that you cited Married to a Man, because honestly, I think the best thing we can do is learn from same-sex relationships. So if you look at two gay men or you look at two gay women and they're in a monogamous relationship, there are no predefined roles. They have to negotiate them. And so they sit down with each other, they negotiate who's going to do what, and they kind of pick their lanes based on their talents and their drives. And if you look at a heteronormative couple, those are going to tend to lean masculine or feminine, but not always and not on everything. And so when a man shows up as a husband, they respect the leadership of their partner in the areas they're leading in, and they step up in leadership for the areas that they're leading in. And there's a mutual support and respect for those roles, not a hard line between them, but a joining of respect and care. And that only happens when a conversation occurs to decide. What I see a lot of men struggle with is they show up in a relationship with a woman, and there are these predefined roles that they never discuss, that they just expect to be. And their wives have these predefined roles that they never discussed and they expect to happen. And without a discussion and a negotiation and an acceptance, there's fractures, there's misalignments, and there's a lack of support on both ends. So just by acknowledging the broad variation that a relationship can be makes the possibility for choices, even if your choice as a family is an incredibly traditional one. By acknowledging that that's a choice, you can negotiate how to do it well together. And that's what I encourage men to do and what I push them towards.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, once you have an opening to have an honest and truthful conversation with men and their relationship with masculinity, I'm curious, what are some of the most authentic conversations you have with men that you really think are making a difference, not only in the masculinity portion of their life, but all aspects of their life? Because, if you're not confident in your ability to be a present in your own life, it's hard to sort of marry the masculinity piece. So I'm curious about your thoughts on authenticity when it comes to conversations with men, because a lot of men are afraid to share their emotions because of the stigma around that. So I'm curious to ask you about sort of the authentic version of conversations you have with men and how some of the most authentic conversations start. What are your thoughts there?
Well, the first thing is to acknowledge authentic conversations don't happen without safety, and the world is generally not safe. A colleague of mine said this to me, and it's resonated and stuck with me for years now. Our jobs as clinicians are to teach men that they don't have to hold it together all the time, but they have to hold it together most of the time. And just by starting with the acknowledgement that to be a man in the world is to be a little contained when appropriate, opens the door for finding those spaces where it doesn't need to be contained. And this is where finding men's groups, relationships where you have that emotional authenticity and safety, the times and places where we choose to let our emotions really run things for a little while, is so empowering. Because if you're not taking the time, space, and connection to let those emotions guide things, They will choose it for you, and they will almost always choose times where it is not appropriate and you can't be effective. This is where the kind of explosive anger of men come in, right? If all I can do is contain and contain and contain, no receptacle is infinite. It's kind of like if you take a 3-pound weight and you're a strong guy, no matter how strong you are, if you just hold your arm out with a 3-pound weight, eventually that weight becomes too heavy and you don't choose when you put it down. So no matter what we're carrying, we need spaces to do so. But that acknowledges that not every space is a space for emotional vulnerability. A lot of times, you're existing in the world to show up for your world and be of service, to do your job, to hold things, to create safety for others. And you can't always do that while being emotionally vulnerable. There are times and places for it.
Yeah, so building on that, Tim, I'm curious to ask you about, strength through vulnerability and what it means for a man to celebrate their emotional vulnerability. What does that mean to you, my friend?
Well, so I think our greatest examples of that are men like Terry Crews and Kevin Smith. These are men that have exhibited the strength and skill that's required for men to have status, and then leveraged that status to normalize various ways that men are in pain and not acknowledging. And I think the first thing is to accept that as our masculinity is a status we have to earn, finding your area of competence is going to be key for you developing out your safety. And as young men, accepting that to become competent at something means you have to be willing to fail at something. No one gets good or masterful at anything without going through any number of failures. I think of people like you that have been podcasting for so long. I just started one, right? I'm 12 episodes in, and you can hear the difference between me on my podcast and you after so many episodes and so long doing what you do. You have to be willing to show up to get good at something. And once you're established and you've got the safety of competency, there's room for you to say, these are the areas where I've struggled in competency. These are the struggles I've experienced. This is the emotional journey that took to get good at things. And by normalizing that pain in that process, we leave the room for so many more men to experience it without breaking, to experience it with accepting that these things are hard and it's okay that you don't start good at them.
I always tell people that no matter how many degrees on a wall that you have, you can always learn something from someone else, can't you?
Every time. Every time.
Absolutely. Tim, building on your last point, how do you think it's important for men to develop, and how can we help men develop an environment of psychological safety where they're able to positively or negatively self-reflect in order to grow, my friend? So I guess the question would be, how do you view the importance of psychological safety, and how can we get men to view that as a personal and professional strength, my friend?
So I think the easiest way to do it for most guys is to frame out emotional expression as a skill. Men tend to really enjoy in having a way to be better at something. And if we don't see a path forward, if there isn't some kind of operationalization of it, most guys back out of it. They don't want to do it. So when I work with somebody, the first thing we do is do a skills assessment. Can you name and describe what you're feeling? When you name and describe what you're feeling, do you know what to do with that power and that emotion? How do you channel it in your world in an effective way? And almost every adult has ways that they're really good at that. When I'm working with a guy who's a former athlete, he might not be able to tell you how he feels, but he can tell you when he feels poorly, he goes to the gym and feels better. When I work with an engineer, he may not be able to use emotional language to describe what happens, but he can break down the process of his day and where it went sideways on him really, really well. And for some men, they might not have logical, systematic language to describe what their day looks like, but they can tell you how they feel. And by bridging the gap between those three aspects, all of a sudden you have a complete person that can engage the world in more effective ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim, just because I'm personally curious to get your answer, as I shared with you earlier, July is National Disability Pride Month, my friend. And as you know, I was born with cerebral palsy, and I have dedicated my entire adult life to advocating for the full inclusion of folks with disabilities into the workforce. And I know that employment inclusion isn't sort of your bailiwick, but you've been around a lot of executives and people within the professional space, my friend. So I'm curious to get your thoughts, my friend, and opinion on how we break down the barriers towards inclusion for men and others in the workforce with a disability in order to be accepted, my friend. What are your thoughts there on how we can create more opportunities, my friend?
Well, I think it's key to look at how we treat veterans. So, veterans, just not even based on war wounds, I'm not even necessarily talking about people that are carrying physical injuries from war. We develop out Parkinson's and neurological disease about 10 years earlier than the general public. Our service often leaves us hurt and unable in certain ways. And yet, our service protects us. People are much more likely to see a veteran with a disability as an effective person. And we also need to start accepting that with modern medicine, all of us will likely be disabled in our lifetime. At some point, we will be kept alive and as functional as possible with debilitating issues. And so it boils down to, by creating room for people with disabilities, we're accepting that we're creating room for our lifelong contributions. That once someone has an issue, if we can still incorporate that person, we're maintaining their strength, their expertise, their beauty, and their art into our world. And by doing so, we're making room for ourselves. I find that people, as lovely as it would be for people to be entirely motivated by what somebody else needs, it's just not how Americans operate. And by incorporating the story of, hey, at some point, you're not going to run as fast. At some point, standing is going to start to hurt. At some point, you're not going to be able to do the things you do the way you do them. Don't you want to have room to keep impacting your world in the way that you want to? That humanizes it across the board, and it gives people some skin in the game and allows for the room for so many people that bring so much to the table simply by having a ramp or an elevator instead of stairs, simply by having the technology that we've built enable us to share thoughts from people that have a harder time sharing their thoughts. We need to leverage everything we've built to include the strength and power of our entire society.
Yeah, and just hearing you give that last chance, so another question of interest popped into my mind, and this is the question, Tim. How do you think, when we talk about relationship building, every successful relationship at some point will require compromise. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on the relationship when you work with people between compromise and masculinity, because if you want a successful relationship, you're not always going to get the way that you want the cookie to crumble, so to speak. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on the relationship between masculinity and compromise and how it's associated with building and maintaining effective relationships. What are your thoughts there?
So I think when we started equating masculinity to control, we started building in isolation and a lack of relationship. You cannot connect to who you control. And this is where leadership over control happens. This is where the idea that you are with an effective partner instead of somebody that you need to manage comes into play. And this is incredibly important because we know, so there's these researchers called the Gottmans. The doctors Gottman have been in the mental health field for decades, and they successfully operationalized observing couples for a short amount of time and predicting whether they would be together in 7 years. That was where they got their start. And they have since continued to collect data. And the data point that most shocked me recently was that 80% of the arguments that couples have never change. They're just preferences. So the example I always like to use is me and my ex-wife, we travel very differently. She's a bit of an anxious traveler. She wants to get to the airport 3 hours early. She wants to walk by the gate where the flight is going to take off, even if it's not listed yet. And then she wants to go relax and have a meal, knowing that she's ready to do whatever is required for her travel. I really dislike traveling like that. I want to walk through security and walk to my plane and get on my plane. And in 10 years, I've only missed one flight because I'm pretty good at it. Which means that when we would travel together, one of us would be miserable. One of us would either, or both of us would be fairly unhappy because we wouldn't have what we needed. And that wasn't going to change. There wasn't a negotiation that was going to make both of us happy. It was more an acceptance that we need to figure out how we're traveling to meet someone else's needs and how much sacrifice and appreciation is required by the other party. So the deal we worked out was if we were traveling internationally or we had connecting flights, we did it her way. But then when we were sitting in the airport and I was eating an overpriced meal after we'd gotten there so early, she would look at me and say, "Hey, thank you so much for doing this. My morning has been so much better." And then if we were doing a direct national flight, we'd get on the plane and she'd be kind of sweaty and been stressed all morning. And I look at her as we sit down on the plane and I say, "Thank you so much for this morning. It really made my day better." And just by acknowledging the difference and appreciating the service required for the other and doing that consistently, our relationship improved. And I think that's where masculinity breaks things. The traditional form of masculinity as control denies that context and that negotiation.
Yeah, so building on that, Tim, I'm curious if I asked you to rewrite the definition of men leading by example, how do you think you would rewrite that definition, my friend?
Well, I think it's already very well written. I think we just need to stop dictating control as the example. The example can be kindness. You can be kind and direct. You can empower people. You can speak to their emotions. You can speak to their motivations. And you can show up and do the job well. And let people see that. Let people see somebody doing that in a way that incorporates others, that leverages the broad skill and personalities that are brought to a project. You don't lead by managing and controlling what people do. You lead by example. You lead through your humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Tim, my final question for you has to do with your own personal and professional legacy, my friend. And how important is it for you to define that, my friend? And how do you want that to be defined?
Well, my father wasn't a religious man. And when I had a teenage kind of crisis of spirituality, we weren't raised with church. I went around and I was outside of DC growing up. So I got to go to all these different religious organizations, churches, synagogues, temples, and fields for a summer, trying to figure out what spirituality and meaning might be for me. And at the end of the summer, I hadn't figured anything out. I just felt that any of these places I went to, I didn't feel connected to. And so I go back to my partying biker father and ask him, what are these things meaning to us? And he said something that stuck with me my whole life, which is, I just want to leave the world better than I found it. And I want to treat people as well as I can. And if that's not enough to get me into whatever comes next, I don't want to sit at that table. And so for me, I am a flawed person. I have hurt people. I have failed friends and loved ones. And I've made a lot of people's lives better, to include my friends and loved ones. I've helped hundreds of men, and I'm hoping that work like you and I are doing right now can help thousands of men live better lives. And so hopefully by the end of my life, I'll have done more good than harm, and that people will remember me for some of the good I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tim, I'm going to sneak one more question in just because you piqued my interest in terms of your last answer. And I'm curious to get your perspective on giving men permission to acknowledge that flaws in appearance or the way they handle situations are okay, my friend. So how do we give men the permission structures to say that their own personal or professional flaws are learning experiences they can learn from? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think that goes back to the idea of masculine and feminine traits and masculine and feminine patterning being in all of us. So for some men, the traditional stoicism works for them. That's something they want to be, but that doesn't mean they're not experiencing the emotion, and it doesn't mean they're not sharing that when appropriate. And for some men, that model of being in the world and connecting isn't going to work. They've got to be able to do it a different way and still be a man. And so by acknowledging the broad ways that we can connect and we can exist in the world, to then have choices on how to do it effectively, that freedom is terrifying. We want a structure, we want to know what to do. But by giving the individual a framework of what are you choosing to do? And how do we make that not more or less than someone else, but this is what's effective for you. These are the ways that you connect and that you serve and that you provide purpose. And that's powerful and wonderful, but it doesn't detract from the ways that others might. By giving that broadness, by embracing that individualism of America, we'll do so much better as men and we'll exist so much happier.
Yeah, well, Tim, I can't thank you enough for all of the great insight you left me with today, my friend. But before I say goodbye to you this morning, I want to know if people want to get connected with you, my friend, what's the best way they can do that?
So if they're curious more about thoughts on masculinity and what we're doing to try to change that in the country, go to AmericanMasculinity.com. That's where I've got the podcast going where we're having informed, nuanced conversations with various experts to talk about how men are existing and how they can exist better in this country. And so far, I've been so lucky to get the people that we've been able to have on. And it's really begun to solidify and change how I engage these things. If you're in Colorado and you're looking for counseling and you want to work with me directly, the best way to do that is to go to my website, which is www.empoweredchangece.com.
Well, fabulous, my friend. I want to personally thank you for giving men the emotional courage and intelligence to lead more fulfilling lives, my friend. This was a wide-ranging and vast conversation that covered a lot of topics and areas of interest, my friend. I want to thank you for the good work that you do to support men's mental health and marriages, my friend, and for engaging in conversation with me this morning. It's most appreciated.
Of course, man. And thanks so much for what you do, bringing the masculinity forward in the various ways it can be. The leadership you're exhibiting is exactly what we need in the world. And I can't tell you how meaningful it is.